My name is Michael Blackwell, and together with Joe Anderton, I coordinate the work of the Norwich Society Historians Group. As you know, each year from October through to June, we organise a programme of monthly meetings where somebody comes along to give a presentation about some aspect of the history of Norwich. We're not going to be able to do this, unfortunately, this year, but we are going to try and bring a number of talks to you via our Norwich Society YouTube channel. Today I'm going to take my turn and I'm going to talk to you about theatre in Norwich in the 18th century. I have to warn you that there are some glitches in the video. On 2 or 3 occasions, 2 of the pictures overlap, but this only lasts for a few seconds and it doesn't stop the comprehension of the talk. So anyway, just to let you know, it's not your computer that is wrong, it's something wrong with the video. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this presentation. Thank you. So today I'd like to set my talk in what historians call the long 18th century. That is to say, from the Restoration in the late 17th century through to the Regency in the early 19th century. I'd like to explore what dramatic performances could be seen in Norwich, where they took place, and how acting troops dealt with the frequent censorship and attacks from both local and national authorities. First, a very quick survey of what we know about drama before the period of our focus. What came before the long 18th century? In the 15th and early 16th centuries, there are some accounts of mainly religious drama in Norwich. We know that mystery plays were being acted out in the city centre in the 15th century by the local tradesmen's guilds. Each guild took turns to present one Bible story. Generally, the mercers and drapers started off with the story of the creation. The plays were meant to be inspirational, but there was comedy as well. For example, Cain's ploughboy and Noah's wife were always played for laughs. And then later came the morality plays, which harshly denounced the monastic system and were championed by Sir Thomas Cromwell. There are records of other dramatic performances by local people as mummers or waits or in pageants and fairs. It is only towards the end of the 16th century that secular plays became popular and that we see the first paid actors in Norwich. There are some accounts of strolling players coming to the city. These travelling troupes of players performed everything from Shakespeare to more ephemeral plays, often in the courtyards or inns. Life was hard for many of these groups. They travelled on foot, pushing a barrow containing their rudimentary costumes and props. The local Norwich authorities did not like the players' visits. Court records show that in 1616 and 1620, several people were brought before the court for some kind of involvement in stage plays. And in 1623, the Privy Council obviously responded to complaints raised by the Norwich authorities, wrote to the mayor granting him authorization to forbid players, tumblers, dancers, and that type of vagrant and licentious rabble. Stopping play performances became easier after Oliver Cromwell came to power in 1653. The Puritan Parliament legislated to define all actors as rogues and vagabonds, liable to be whipped or imprisoned if they exercised their vocation. Parliament also required the demolition of stages and theatre setups around the country, and even decreed fines of 5 shillings for every person caught watching a theatre performance. Let's talk now about the development of more permanent venues within the city. After the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, Norwich became an acknowledged centre of theatrical activity. You can see on this map the White Swan Inn, the Angel, the King's Arms, the Queen's Arms, and the Red Lion, all notable dramatic venues. By the mid-18th century, the Norwich Company of Comedians had become a professional and well-paid company, having a substantial following in Norwich. This group toured the region, but they had a permanent stage and base at the White Swan Inn that stood on ground now beneath the Forum Library. By the mid-18th century, it seemed clear that the city could support a larger and better equipped theatre. There was a strong local demand for dramatic performances, and it seemed a good chance that an entrepreneur who built it would get a good return on his investment. In 1757, Thomas Ivory, a leading local architect and builder, stepped forward to take on this challenge. He was the man responsible for the Octagon Chapel, houses in Surrey Street, and other iconic local buildings. The theatre he built was next to the recently completed Assembly Rooms and was called the New Theatre near Chapelfield. Ivory had the goodwill of the local magistrates and the support of a good part of the city's better heeled, who welcomed the new opportunities for sociability and amusement that the theatre provided. Technically, though, the theatre operation was illegal, at least until 1768. In 1767, a milestone law was passed that empowered the Lord Chamberlain to grant licenses for the performance of stage plays outside of London. Licenses were granted for Edinburgh in 1767, followed by Bath and Norwich the following year. The Norwich Act was given the royal assent on 8th of March 1768, and the license was issued just a few days later than the one issued for Bath. Therefore, Norwich narrowly missed out on the honour of being the first royally sanctioned provincial theatre in England. The Norwich Mercury proudly commented, "Our regular and elegant theatre, which has hitherto been honoured by the approbation and countenance of the sensible and polite, will now also happily enjoy the sanction and protection of our laws." The licence permitted the theatre company to perform plays in Norwich from the 1st of November to the end of May every year, and for 3 weeks during the summer, including the week in which the assizes were held. This was a big week in the city's social calendar and attracted visitors from all over the county. As a result of the licence, the new theatre near Chapelfield became the Theatre Royal, and the Norwich Company of Comedians began advertising itself on the playbills as His Majesty's servants. So we've looked at the main developments in the period with regard to the number and availability of theatrical venues. Now I want to look again at the period as a whole and ask the questions, just why were the king and the local authorities so opposed to dramatic performances? At a national level, the monarch and the government feared that plays might carry seditious messages. They were reluctant to license spaces where audiences could gather to witness potentially subversive productions. The local authorities feared any location or any occasion that brought large groups of people together and increased the risk of public disorder. They were influenced by many religious authorities who still believed that theatrical performances encouraged immorality. And finally, some local authorities and employers feared that theatres led to time wasting and took ordinary people away from their labours. So for all these reasons, the Puritan anti-theatre legislation was not removed from the statute books, and actors outside the permitted theatres in London could still fall foul of local authorities and be brought before the courts as vagrants. The feared impact on the local economy was well illustrated in 1669. Performing groups visited Norwich had become so numerous that in December of that year, the mayor and aldermen sent an intermediary to the king, quote, to obtain an order to prevent the acting of stage plays in the city, unquote. The letter complained that the frequent visits of stage and puppet plays diverted, quote, the meaner sort of people, unquote, from their work in the manufactories. Here it should be added that performances rarely began after 6 o'clock, and so workers had to leave their employment early to attend. The players, the city authorities claimed, drained too much money from the inhabitants, and Norwich is being daily impoverished by decay of trade and the charge of maintaining the poor. The king finally gave a positive response in mid-February to the mayor's relief. He authorized the city authorities, quote, to determine the time during which the said players shall stay in the city, and they are to remain no longer, unquote. As to the fear of sedition, it would have not been possible for a play like the recent King Charles III to have been written and performed, but it was certainly possible for actors to take existing plays and perform them in a way that implied some criticism of the king or government. Falstaff, for example, could be certainly played that way. There are numerous examples in Norwich of concerns about sedition. In 1716, there was a performance at the White Swan of the Earl of Mar, which told the story of the Jacobite uprising of the previous year. When the part of proclaiming the pretender as king was acted out on the stage and the players gave a formal hurrah at it, the people and here is a quote, the people also in the galleries gave a great shout, whereupon Captain Hall and some other gentlemen, well affected to King George, began to hiss at them, at which they not only shouted louder, but clapped their hands and stamped with their feet to the degree that the house rang again. Upon that, the gentlemen drew their swords and cried out, down with the rebels, down with them, damn 'em, we'll mar 'em, which set the ladies shrieking and put all the house in disorder. The play was performed again the following night, and the audience in the galleries not only shouted as they did before, but had the impudence to hiss at what was spoken of His Most Sacred Majesty, King George. Concern reached a peak 20 years later when Prime Minister Robert Walpole was worried by several plays telling a story from history from which uncomfortable contemporary implications could be drawn, such as William Harvard's Charles I, satirical plays by John Gay and Henry Fielding, and a play called The Golden Rump. The main character resembled George II. Just like George, he was a man of short, corpulent build and an unfortunate possessor of a disproportionately large posterior and an affection of piles. Some question as to whether Walpole himself commissioned this, so it's not sure if that is or not fake news. Parliament passed the new Licensing Act in 1737, squeezing the law in at the tail end of the parliamentary session. The Act confirmed earlier legislation that any actors performing without the King's patent or Chamberlain's license would be doing so illegally and could be deemed rogues or vagabonds. These issues of disrespect and loyalty flared up periodically throughout the century. As late as 1800, a group of soldiers in the audience at the Theatre Royal called for the national anthem to be sung after the first play of the evening. when the second place started without the anthem being sung, they considered the management and audience disrespectful, drew their swords and cleared the house, bruising some spectators and damaging clothes. 5 of the soldiers were apprehended, and at the quarter sessions, some weeks later, the 4 ensigns and 1 lieutenant pleaded guilty to causing a riot and were fined £5 each. Around the same time, King Lear, with its story of a mad king, was banned from performance anywhere in the country. While the national authorities feared sedition, the local authorities were more concerned about public disorder throughout this period. Norwich was a comparatively affluent city, but was rapidly growing. Improving child survival rates were increasing the number of potentially unruly young people, while the influx of immigrants from the depressed surrounding villages increased the number of ill-housed, hungry, unemployed. In the days before the establishment of a police force, the authorities could not respond quickly to a crowd that got out of control. Clashes between locals and soldiers stationed in Norwich were particularly feared. Anne Ditchell wrote to a friend in the early 1790s when there were frequent tensions between the military and the local population. She wrote, "The theatre has become a scene of terror for the ladies since the last regiments of soldiers arrived. It is not unusual now for the officers to break their swords with fighting and rioting at the theatre, while the common soldiers are insulting and disgracing themselves and human nature in the streets. However, I am happy to say some few regulations have been made to prevent such depredations on the public peace in the future." They were particularly concerned about the cheaper forms of entertainment, such as puppet shows, that attracted a rough crowd to the drinking establishments. In the 1740 Christmas season alone, there were 3 puppet shows on in the city, and it's reported that at one of the locations, 100 people per night were being turned away. The link between theatre and immorality had some historic underpinning. First, many of the groups of strolling players lived quite rough lives. They performed in inns and were probably often paid in drink. They didn't stay at the best inns in town. Indeed, they would often sleep together in barns. In their performances, depending on the audiences, they often played up innuendos and made coarse gestures that would please their audiences. Shakespeare provided them with much material, some of which went beyond the bawdy into the outright obscene. Take, for example, Twelfth Night. There is a famous scene in which Malvolio studies the penmanship of a letter to determine whether it's from Olivia, and says, "By my life, this is my lady's hand. These be her very C's," and then he picks out a number of other letters, which he says demonstrate it's from Olivia, but these other letters, when put together, form a vulgar word for a part of female anatomy. And once he's completed the word, he goes on to say, "And thus makes she her great peas." Shakespeare knew very well how this scene would be acted, how it would be acted out for the groundlings. We also know that there were prostitutes who gathered in or near the Norwich theatres. The manager of the Theatre Royal wrote in 1799 that the exit ways from the theatre needed to be enlarged, saying, "It is really other ways impossible that ladies can reach their carriages without danger of spoiling their dresses and being squeezed perhaps between doorkeepers, porters and prostitutes who are forcing their way without regard to beauty or dress." Interesting what he sees as being the main problem caused by the prostitutes, i.e. they were blocking the way for the ladies. Many would have agreed with John Wesley, who declared, Most of the present stage entertainments sap the foundations of all religion, as they naturally tend to efface all traces of piety and seriousness out of the minds of men. They are peculiarly hurtful to a trading city, giving a wrong turn to youth, especially gay, trifling, and directly opposite to the spirit of industry and close application to business. And as drinking and debauchery of every kind are constant attendants on these entertainments, with indolence, effeminacy, and idleness which affect trade to a high degree. I'd now like to move on to a consideration of how the acting groups got round the prohibitions. Firstly, musical pieces were much less regulated than plays. So theatre managers started putting music prominently on their playbills. In 1759, just 1 year after it opened, Ivory tried to ward off possible problems by renaming his new theatre as the Grand Concert Hall. He advertised concerts of music with plays in small type presented free as interludes. So the concert bill would have in big type 3 short pieces with, say, Hamlet in smaller type as an interlude between the first 2 and a farce. And a farce again in smaller type before the final piece of music. And that could just be a folk song. No one was fooled, of course, but this nod towards the letter of the law does seem to have protected the Norwich Theatre from an early closure or court case. This was the time when burlettas came into fashion. These were originally comic operettas, but in the mid-18th century, the word was used in a very elastic way to describe any play that included songs or music. Therefore, if a theatre management felt under pressure, a farce or a more serious play could be performed, and as long as it has some music added to it, it could be called a burletta. In the difficult years around the French Revolution, Brunton and the management of the Theatre Royal made sure they played nothing that could offend the authorities. He refused to perform plays with any Republican sentiments and chose only those with a more Burkean outlook. Recent research has shown how the city's conservatives centred themselves around the Theatre Royal, while the radical thinkers gathered around the Octagon Chapel, the so-called Enfield Circle. Both of them ivory buildings, by the way. Another interesting feature of 18th century theatre was the way in which audiences were calmed by mellow adaptations of Shakespeare. A feel-good version of Romeo and Juliet was performed in 1758, in which, according to the local paper, the lives of every virtuous, unoffending character were preserved. In 1761, the Theatre Royal advertised a Macbeth, quote, very much altered in order to allay the fears of ladies who might be alarmed by the thunder and lightning in the play. That same year, if you'd come to see King Lear, you would have left the theatre warmed to know that Lear, after all his travails, ended his days in tranquility and happiness with his daughter Cordelia. And with this slide, I end this talk, which I hope that you found interesting.